All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Using Voting Records in Family History Research. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be your moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Senior Genealogist Melanie McComb. Melanie assists library visitors both on site and online with their family history research. Melanie holds a BS from the State University of New York at Oswego. She is an international lecturer who teaches on a variety of topics, including colonial through 20th century American military research, genetic genealogy, Atlantic Canadian, African American, Jewish, and Irish genealogy. She is also an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. She has had articles published in American Ancestors magazine and 50 Plus Advocate. She is also a blogger known as the Shamrock Genealogist. So if your ancestor had the right to vote, you can find a wealth of information in their voting records. These records can help you to verify the exact years your ancestor lived in a certain location, locate your ancestor on a state census, identify when your ancestor was naturalized, and more. Today, Melanie will cover where to find voting records, the information they contain, and how to use them to advance your family history research. At any point during today's presentation, please feel free to go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many as we can at the end. There's also an optional syllabus available for purchase if you are interested, and your purchase helps support us in making these free webinars. This presentation is also being recorded for later viewing on our website and YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, please welcome Melanie.
Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We have a short amount of time and a lot to cover, so I'm just going to jump right in, and we have enough time to cover everything, and we'll answer some questions towards the end of the webinar. We're going to start off with looking at a history of voting in the United States, because this impacts who actually is going to be on the voter records and just some more of the context about what might have been collected during this time. When we look in early colonial America, especially when we look in parts of like New England, for example, we see that the earliest voters were those that were known as freemen. They were males that were usually over 21 years old. Depending on the colony, they needed to be a member of the church. You had to apply for this privilege. You actually needed to take a freeman's oath, which usually required loyalty to the colony. And you also had to own land and be of good character. So in some cases, you might even had to be recommended to actually be part of this group of individuals. Being designated a freeman meant you could then participate in your local town meetings, have a say in the town business, serve on juries with your peers, etc. We're going to take a moment to learn more about some of the earlier town governments that were occurring in New England and other locations in the early United States. Largely all of the town affairs were being managed by the town itself. So this was the most local level of government that was being done. And this practice even continues today, in which we actually, in New England, elect town selectmen and hold town meetings to run the business. And that is why there are so many records at this time period are recorded at the town level, because this was the basic unit of government. The town government was comprised of several elected officials, which included such titles as selectman, a town clerk, a constable, fence viewers, surveyor of highways, and many more. These officials were elected by the freemen, or the individuals that we talked about who were entitled to vote. Keep in mind that in New England, the organization and conduct of town government was highly influenced by the town founders' religious views. We were not looking at separation of church and state that we would later find in later documents. So when we're looking at what's occurring here, we have to remember that the early New England settlers brought their English government tools, such as their laws, their record keeping, as well as their traditions in using that. An example of how different colonies adapted the English framework to their own situations, we can look at different comparisons of the different colonies. For example, in Massachusetts Bay, church participation was a condition in order to be a freeman. However, in the Connecticut colony, but we're not talking about the New Haven colony, they actually allowed all men, whether they went to church or not, to apply for freeman status. There were many different town officers that would be elected during a time depending on their different needs. Oftentimes, you would have a moderator who would oversee the different meetings, the town clerk who would be responsible for recording the different meeting minutes, as well as all the vital records that people had to register at the town level, and also things like dog licenses and other things like earmarks. There were the selectmen, or in Rhode Island, there was town councilors who would really oversee a lot of the business of what's going on in the town. You would have local constables and treasurers, people collecting taxes and other financial payments being made. And depending on the size of this town, you might find that they seem sort of semi-hereditary. So it was very common you would find that different families might be ingratiated into local politics very early on, and there might be a tradition of that family continuing to serve in a lot of those roles. We really start to see some changes being made when we first move into after the Revolutionary War and we hold our first federal election. This was actually the first time that it was actually held over the span of 2 years, from 1788 to 1789, following the ratification of the Constitution. Similar to what we saw with freemen, the voters had to be white male landowners over age 21. However, we were not requiring that they had to be churchgoers necessarily. This is when we had our first president, George Washington, who was elected, who unanimously won the electoral votes from the Electoral College, which is still a feat that hasn't been defeated today. And we also elected our first Congress as well. It's estimated that for the voters that did vote, that only about 6% of the population actually was eligible to vote. There also were different milestones based on religion. So even though you didn't necessarily need to be a churchgoer at the time, if you were of a certain denomination, certain states actually barred you from voting in these elections. In 1789, for example, some of the states actually barred Catholics, Jews, and Quakers from voting in the first presidential election. So if they knew that your religion was not in congruence with their religion, which mostly was Congregationalism, you were not going to be eligible if you were one of those groups. And it really wasn't until 1828 when Maryland was the final state to remove these religious restrictions, which allowed Jews to vote. This was actually a bill that was passed to amend their constitution, and it was known as the Jew Bill, so to speak, to actually remove this and allow them to vote. So keeping in mind that in a lot of places, like Maryland, they were very much more of, for a while, part of a more Catholics were in the leading religion at the time. We're going to talk about some different milestones for different groups as well. Well, of course, we have women's suffrage. Women's suffrage has had quite a vast history, and it's changed a lot over time. Even as early as 1776, women were actually granted voting rights because in New Jersey, they actually granted it to all inhabitants. They didn't explicitly say that they had to be male. So that was something that was really revolutionary at the time. And it wasn't even until 1807 when the law was finally passed to actually bar them from voting. And what's really interesting is that in that time period in 1790, New Jersey even amended their state constitution where they added that he or she could vote in their election clause. So I find that really interesting that New Jersey was very progressive at the time compared to a lot of the other states where it took a long time. The Seneca Falls Convention was held in 1848, and this was very revolutionary as it was the first women's rights convention that was held in the United States. It was held from July 19th to July 20th, 1848 at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. If you ever go a chance to go up there, they have really wonderful museums and historic parks that talk about the history up there. 1872, we see suffragette Susan B. Anthony was actually arrested after she voted in a presidential election. So it wasn't so much that she was not only arrested in her hometown of Rochester, but she was also indicted, tried, and even convicted for voting illegally. There was a 2-day trial that was held in June of 1873, which she later described as the greatest judicial outrage history has ever recorded. She was convicted and was sentenced to pay a fine of $100 and court costs. We start to then see that states are starting to look at adding different women's rights into their constitution, with Wyoming being one of the first, with Wyoming adding the right to vote in 1890. We then saw that there was different suffrage movements that were being held. There was an early non-official march that was held in the early 1900s in New York City, but the big one was in 1913, which we saw that poster before of women's suffrage held in DC. And finally, by 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified and added to the Constitution, which finally allowed women to vote. However, this really was only impacting white women at the time, as we'll see as we talk about some of the other groups. This is a suffrage victory map that gives you an idea of some of the different timelines of when different laws were being passed, knowing that the ones that were in the solid line line shading were giving full suffrage rights. Some of them were only giving it based on the voting in the primary elections. Some of them were based on just presidential, and some of them were more into more municipal, like school elections and local town elections as well. So you can start to get a sense of like how most of uh, the far west and Midwest was definitely more open to suffrage, and as you go through more of the East Coast, through the South, up even all the way up to almost New York, where there was no suffrage, where the 19th Amendment really was the first place of actually granting full suffrage rights. Now let's talk about suffrage for African Americans. Before we even get into looking at the 14th Amendment, we have to go back even all the way to 1821. New York had actually amended their constitution to expand property qualifications in order for African Americans to vote. African American men had to own at least $250 in property and hold residency for at least 3 years to be able to vote. However, there was none of these qualifications in effect for white Americans. Post-Civil War, we had a couple of different Reconstruction Acts were passed. So there was a first Reconstruction Act, and then there was the second. The second one is the biggest one of impact for voting rights because this is when the southern states, except Tennessee, were divided into what are known as military districts. There was a union head of the military district that was appointed, and they were required to register all males 21 and over, including African Americans. So that's why you see that 1867 might be the earliest time period you find a lot of African Americans were on the rolls, is because they had that military enrollment period to enforce that. By 1868 is when we officially have the 14th Amendment passed, which had finally granted full citizenship rights to formerly enslaved persons. And that was a very big deal and something that was very much disputed by a lot of the later states who were not enforcing that citizenship right. In response to looking at, especially with post-Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era, we see these laws being passed to bar African Americans from voting by passing things that they thought would impede them ability to do so, such as requiring literacy tests or paying poll tax. having to pay a certain amount of money to be able to have the privilege to vote. This actually was even the first time in 1870 when Thomas Mundy Peterson was actually the first African American to vote in a local election. And a lot of African Americans had faced a lot of danger with even trying to vote. There are a number of cases I've heard, both historically and also through just different patrons we've worked with, where someone might have been the victim of attempted or actually completed lynchings if they had tried to exercise their right to vote. It was a very dangerous time. Sojourner Truth, even as well, also tried to demand a ballot at the same time as Susan B. Anthony, and unfortunately, she was actually turned away for that ability to vote as well. Moving on, looking at some of the different suffrage rights for Native Americans. Native Americans have always been treated, obviously, like second-class citizens when it comes to their rights, especially with their land. And this actually had culminated in many different Supreme Court cases that were passed. In 1876, the Supreme Court had ruled in the case Elk versus Wilkins that Native Americans were not citizens and therefore could not vote. This was a case that was focused on John Elk. He was a Native American man who had actually left his reservation and had decided to assimilate himself into white society, but he was still denied the right to vote. And the Justice Horace Gray, who had wrote the majority opinion, he stated that he had no claim to citizenship because he had never been naturalized, even though he was Native American and was born in this country. And they said that the 14th Amendment did not apply to him because he was born a subject of an Indian nation, and therefore, as a sovereign nation, therefore could not inherit the rights of the United States. We started to see that citizenship started to be eased up with 1887 with the Dawes Severalty Act, also known as the General Allotment Act, which was passed by the federal government, where they divided Native American reservation land into individual plots. So those individuals that had decided to give up their tribal affiliations and be enrolled in what we know the Dawes rolls could then have the ability to have federal land awarded to them. So it was almost like a version of the Homestead Act for Native Americans at that time. The Indian Naturalization Act of 1890 finally granted citizenship to Native Americans, but it was through an application process that had to go through approvals. So it really wasn't until 1924 when we have the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924 where citizenship was actually awarded to all Native Americans. Now, there was a special clause, though, in place for Native Americans that served during World War I. Those that had served in 1919 were allowed to become citizens for their patriotism and help during World War I, especially when you look at the Native American code talkers. They had actually helped transmit encrypted messages during World War I, which was integral to make sure that we could actually protect a lot of that intelligence because it hadn't been broken by the Germans. Okay. Looking at suffrage for Asian Americans, this really was culminating with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was really the first federal law that restricted immigration solely based on nationality and really fueled a lot of anti-Chinese racism and mistreatment of the Chinese people in the United States. It even prohibited Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States for 10 years and threatened deportation and imprisonment for those who tried. It also prevented them from becoming U.S. citizens, making them permanent aliens here in the country with no chance of reuniting with their family or starting new families. It also had an impact, especially on women coming in as well. A lot of times, women that were seen as being Asian American coming in, they were treated almost like they were prostitutes. They did not think that they were being serious about their intentions of coming over, and were even more so impacted as well. Supreme Court had went through many different rulings in which they had ruled that that Japanese Americans were ineligible for citizenship as well as Asian Indians over time from 1922 to 1923. In 1925, there was basically a clause that allowed Filipinos that if they served in the Navy for 3 years, they could then get citizenship, but otherwise they were barred. And it really wasn't until we got a final act in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act, which had finally granted all people of Asian ancestry the right to become citizens. So if we look at that time period, that's a really long time before they even started to gain their rights. And you can see that obviously that is after World War II had ended by a few years. When we look into some more modern voting rights acts, the next biggest one was the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This was also very big for helping to ensure voting rights for all Americans, especially as well as Hispanic Americans being very much impacted by this. Because this finally was trying to enforce the voting rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments, that anyone that was born or naturalized in the United States had the right to vote. And therefore, states could not pass these laws that would impede people from voting based on their race or ethnicity, including literacy tests, poll tax, all these other things that could be done. Those could not be done in any way to impede that. And this is something that we're always trying to make sure that the Voting Rights Act is continually renewed to make sure that that stays on the books. And then we have the 26th Amendment, which was ratified in 1971, in which this finally granted U.S. citizens the right to vote at the age of 18 years old. As you saw before this, when we learned all the way back to when the freemen were voting, the voting age minimum was actually 21. So this really opened up a whole new population of voters, especially looking at college students and even just high school graduates and others, finally the ability to actually exercise their right to vote and be able to participate in voter registration and be able to exercise that even while they're away from home if they lived away from their parents. So now that we've talked about the history in the United States of voting, let's talk about the actual records themselves and their contents, especially when you're researching these historical records. So going back to the very beginning, we talked about these freeman records. So this is where you'll often will find at the town level the list of names who hold the freeman status. So they took the freeman's oath, they're 21 and older, they have land that are eligible to vote in those elections. These are usually found as lists in the town records when they've identified the different freemen that were noted at a particular time, especially before different elections that were going to take place. A lot of these town records actually have been digitized, and you could find them on sites like FamilySearch.org. This is an example of a list of freemen out of Alberg, Vermont, in which you will see their names. They are not going to be in full alphabetical order, so you do need to make sure you take your time going through them. However, you may be able to find that there could be different members of one particular family that could be all registered together. And again, it's also another version of a census substitute, in this case, between the 1790 and 1800 census, to see who was in that community that was registered, that you would see as probably the possible heads of household that were eligible. In the town minutes themselves, you also see the different records of ballots of who was actually being elected as who was actually on the ballot to be who was nominated for a particular position. So we can see that this is out of Brunswick, Maine in 1860. There were different ballots that were done, whether it was the moderator up at the top, the town clerk, or the selectmen. And then they would usually tally the votes, and those would usually be noted in the records to see who would won that popular vote. And then the majority that would win would then have the position, should they choose to accept it. Now, another type of record that we're going to see going on, especially when we start getting into more modern records, is voter registration books. So these is actually showing you, similar to the Freeman's List, those that are eligible to vote. So you're often going to find a lot of really nice details in here that can help you find out more about them, including their name, their sex, what race they are. As you can see, based on the history, race had a very big impact on who was eligible as well, besides sex. what their address was. Sometimes you even get down to a street address or at least a city. They would ask residency. How many years did you live in the city, the county, the state to make sure you were eligible? They would often note your occupation, if there was a party affiliation that was being recorded, sometimes even down to physical description, height, and weight. Think about they might be looking at different ways of maybe trying to verify identity, especially when there was no licenses that were being used, and of course, when you actually registered. So these registration books can vary based on the different locations where they register, as everyone has different forms or data that they are collecting. So this is an example of a voter registration out of Richmond, Kentucky in 1924. So you'll notice that obviously it's after the 19th Amendment was passed, so women have the right to vote. This voter was Mrs. Jenny K. Slavin out of Richmond. It noted her that she lived on Woodlawn Street. She had registered on September 9th, 1924. She had resided in Kentucky for 46 years. And then it had actually noted approximately how many years it looks like in the above county as well. It looks like it's probably about 24. It noted that she was white. She was age 46. She had no occupation listed, so she was probably a homemaker. She has Democrat as a party affiliation. She was noted as female. She even had down her weight and height, which I'm sure she didn't want to gladly give you that information over. I'm sure that's a little bit personal. She signed her signature. The clerk would then sign his attesting that she had been registered. And then at the bottom, they actually even keep track of the different times when the person voted. So in some cases, they might have just one big voter registration book and they would keep track of all the different times that you had voted in different elections. Now you'll notice they're not all occurring every 2 years or 4 years when you would think, okay, presidential and Congress. Well, it's possible that these could be showing more local municipal elections or school elections taking place. So there might be times where there might be a reason why they're voting in several different elections besides outside of the regular presidential, Congress, and primaries that take place. There also is next the actual voters' registers. So now this is actually showing who actually did vote in an election. So these are going to be a little more brief than the actual registration books, but they include your name, your residence, and sometimes you even get down to a precinct or ward of where you represent in your town or city, your race, your party affiliation, and names of persons they voted for. Now, sometimes that names might not be spelled out, and maybe the party that you voted for is noted instead. In that case, then you would turn to newspapers and other records to identify who was actually running in that race. This is an example of a voter register out of Trick County, Kentucky in 1903, in which we can see the different individuals' names in the second column. We see that they are all living in Cerulean, Kentucky. They are listed as white. They had voted for a Democrat, and they also were affiliated with the Democratic Party. Now, as I mentioned before, there was a tax that was levied as a prerequisite to voting. Poll tax goes all the way back until the 17th century. Massachusetts first passed this poll tax in 1646, followed by the New Haven colony in 1649. It was largely used in a lot of the records, and then over time it kind of went out for a little bit and was then reintroduced, especially in the South. And it was used especially along with literacy tests and other ways to impede, especially African Americans from voting, because you would have to provide a certain amount of money to pay the tax to vote. Now, there was also a clause that was passed called the grandfather clause for poor white Americans that basically said if you could prove your grandfather voted before the Civil War, you would not have to pay this poll tax. But that was only for poor white Americans and didn't account for anybody that was African American or anybody else, as well as anybody that was recently enslaved. The poll tax was finally abolished in 1964, just 1 year before the Voting Rights Act was passed, in which the 24th Amendment was added to the Constitution, as they had declared that the poll tax was not constitutional anymore. Poll tax records are also another form of voter record because while they are a tax record, they have a very close connection to who is actually eligible to vote. So you want to look into the poll tax records to see if your individual is listed because that will help you then to find them in the corresponding voter records if they're available. These actually are poll tax records of those that had paid tax prior to May 1st, 1902 in Granville, North Carolina. And these are individuals that are all listed living in Fishing Creek Township. So oftentimes you'll find that, again, they're going to split out sometimes the sections of where someone's paying poll tax if they have a listing of all those that paid in a particular town or city. This is actually a record of women poll taxpayers out of Dallas County, Alabama. And I really like this particular record because it gives you a lot of good information. It's giving information on what their names are. Sometimes it lists relationships, like Mrs. Eliza Doherty was a widow of a James. You find little clues on here, like at the very bottom, there's a Miss Anne Louise Dees, who is listed as Waves in the U.S. Navy. So now you see some military service that they actually participated in. You get information on when they registered, their age, and it's showing each of the different times that they had paid their poll tax for this. So again, that can help you to find additional records of finding when they might have voted as well. There also are records for election officials. If you decide to become an election clerk or some other poll official, oftentimes you'll be required to sign basically an oath that says that you will uphold the allegiance of the state that you live in and also support the Constitution and that you're going to discharge the duties as a board of elections based on the position you're in, and then you would sign it. So that's also another interesting thing I would try to look for is if you know someone might have participated in the civil process as an election official, you might be able to find their oaths. And this actually was a set of records that I actually found on Family Search out of Kent County, Maryland in 1898, in which we see George W. Atwell, who was residing at Still Pond in Kent County of Maryland in the 2nd District. And he was becoming a clerk. So now that we've talked about some of the different types of records, let's talk about how you can actually find them. And you'll find that they're actually more available online than you might have thought. Now, the locations can vary. There isn't really one place to go, but I'll give you some go-tos that I go to. So, historical voter records can be held in any number of different archives or libraries or offices. You generally can find a lot of these in online genealogical sites like Family Search and Ancestry for those that have been made available, with the originals being held in state archives, public libraries, genealogical societies, your local historical society, different board of election offices, town halls. They're really the sky is the limit in terms of where you can find it. It's really a matter of where did they deposit those records. So you may need to kind of seek out a couple of these to find out where they are. So a great place I like to look to see if to find out where could the records have been deposited is I use the site Archive Grid. Archive Grid is a free site in which many different archives, libraries, and museums, and historical societies that are partner with them actually share things that are in their catalogs. So you can actually do keyword searches to see if you can find a particular set of voting records, in this case, in a particular location in the United States or even internationally as well. So in this example, I just put in the top search bar voter records. And just doing a search of that, I get over 3,000 results. So there are a lot of things that you can find. So then you could start to maybe filter down basically into the different states and counties that you're researching to find out where those records are and where do they start, especially. So if I was going to look at that first entry, I see that there is a record for voter registration records 1872 to 1936, which is the author is the Maryland State Administrative Board of Election Laws, Montgomery County Supervisor of Elections. And if I view the catalog record, it gives me a little more detail on them. So I see that they are actually at the Maryland State Archives. There's actually a map that actually shows you where they are, right in Annapolis, and you could get directions on how you get there. There's also a link to click contact information so you can contact them regarding that collection. And it gives you some nice detail here. So it notes that they have 332 volumes, so quite a large collection. And they note that these include the voter registrations. So again, it's gonna, and this is in this case, these are really more of the actual the registration books. So you get the name of the voter, their address, what party affiliation with they are, their birth date, their birthplace, and their voting record. So the voting record is probably going to tell you that they voted, but perhaps maybe they have voter registers as well that may have been total too. And they even tell you how they're organizing them. So you have to look at the district of where they're living in Montgomery County, in this case, and then alphabetically by the name of the voter. Now, you can find a lot of these voter records on sites like Family Search, which is free. So we're going to show you how to do that. A great place to start is looking at the Family Search Wiki. And this is also in your handout, which Kathleen mentioned is available for sale. And in the Family Search Wiki, there is a page for United States voting records. You could click into the specific voting record articles, which are organized by state and districts, where you can actually click into them to find out more specifically about what voter records are available and where you can find them. So as an example, I clicked into the state of Kentucky, and I see under online resources, they're letting me know that from 1904 to 1935, there are voter registers and registration books, 1904 to 1935. So who's eligible to vote and who actually did vote is in part of that. And we also even get a little history of specific things relevant maybe to Kentucky. So it's letting you know about by 1856, there was universal white male suffrage. 1870, we have the 15th Amendment passed. We got the Jim Crow laws that are starting to be passed in the early 1890s. Women are given the right to vote in 1920, and finally 1965. So it's reminding you of some of those key milestones that we talked about, which I think is really helpful to know how to look for someone. So let's say I went into that collection on Kentucky. So, and oftentimes they'll try to link you to the collections where you can actually actively search where there is a collection that has been indexed, which means that it's going to be searchable when you actually put names in a database. So here I could actually do a search by someone's name, perhaps add maybe a birth year and where they're living to try to find their voter record. Now, other ways you can find records are going through the Family Search catalog. You can access the Family Search catalog by going up to Search, Catalog, and Search by Place. I'm going to actually start searching for San Francisco, and I'm specifically looking at San Francisco County. So that's why I'm only going to do United States, California, San Francisco, and then click Search. And the reason why is that most of the Board of Election offices are held at the county level in a lot of cases. Now, once you get into the catalog of the county you're interested in, you're going to want to look down on the categories until you get to see the section for voting registers. So I see that there are 6 entries. And if I click the caret next to United States on the left next to it, it'll open up those categories to see what's available. I then can see that there's multiple options. There also are published records that are made available, such as there's a book on 1890 by Jane Billings Steiner at the bottom, but I really want to focus on as much of the originals as possible. So in this case, I noticed that there is a collection, California City and County in San Francisco, Great Registers, 1900 to 1922. So I'm going to click into that result. And from here, it's going to tell me a little information about this collection. So I see that it is actually digitized images of the originals that are housed at the San Francisco Public Library History and Archives. So that would be good to know if I ever wanted to view the originals in person, of where I can find this. It lets me know that they are in language in English and that they're digitized. And then I scroll down and actually see the actual film and digital notes. So before we even can dive into finding the record is, well, what happens if the record is not searchable in index? Well, that means we have to try to find if there was an index done for that collection. And the great registers in California, for example, do have indexes. So I would want to look based on the different time periods. So let's say I was looking at that first collection, which is going to cover Volume 2, District 35A, 1900 to 1901. And then I went in and browsed those records by clicking the camera icon. Once I get to the beginning of the images, I can see the names of the books that are added, and I want to make sure I'm in the correct one. So I've located this book here in this case. This is actually Volume 2, which is including districts 35 to 39. So in some cases, you might need to know a little history about the area you're researching to make sure you find out how are they dividing up a county using different maps. So then I can go into my register, and in this case, it's actually a typed index that's included. I can see that this is including for the city and county of San Francisco based on Precinct 16, Assembly District 37. And then I see the list of the names on the left-hand side in alphabetical order. I see their age. I see their street address. I then can see information about if there's information about what floor or room they're in, etc. That's noted there, and also the number of the affidavit that's corresponding to their record in the register. Now, a tip to keep in mind, though, is that, as I mentioned, while we're starting at the county level, you also want to try looking at the city and town level, because there might be some cases, especially with larger cities, where they decide to keep it more at the city level instead of leaving it all at the county. And a good example is looking at the city of Boston. City of Boston voter registers, the originals are actually held at the Boston City Archives in West Roxbury, and they've actually worked with Family Search to digitize their records. So, for example, these are voter registers from 1857 to 1920. And as I go through the different indexes available, I may have different collections. So in this case, they are having separate collections of those that include naturalized male voters. So immigrants that had become citizens might have the separate index potentially, and including the records that are also separately as part of that volume from 1878 to 1888. So sometimes you'll get two things. You might get an index in the beginning, and then there might be records at the end as well. So let's say I was looking up a name and I found in the index, and I found Gerhard Bremer that was listed here, and I see that he is listed in Book 10, page 299. If I go back to my catalog, I then want to scroll down until I see Volume 10, which is the very bottom there, and then I want to go ahead and click in the camera icon to actually go to the records. And here I'm going to scroll over to page 299 at the very top, and then I can find where Gerhard Bremen is actually listed. And here it actually includes his signature, includes his residence, his age, and it includes information on where and when he naturalized, and even has his occupation as well. So very good details to be looking for. Now, another tip to keep in mind, though, too, and this is something a lot of people may not realize, is that even though the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, women still could vote in local elections. So, especially school elections. So, very often you want to make sure you're looking for women prior to 1920 as well, as they may be registered to vote in those school elections, as they might have a very vested interest in why they're participating in that. So within the different collections that you might find, there might be separate women voter registers that are done by ward that you could find in the different collections on Family Search, in this case for Boston. And we found this by actually going back into the catalog and actually finding the voter registers found the ward number, and found the year range that we're interested in. And as you notice here, they also have listings for native voter registers. So you also will see those as well when they might separate out potentially naturalized men and native voter registers for men and women as well. And then once I get into the book, then I can look into the register of voters. And every city is going to be a little different in what information they gather. This one was actually quite detailed. So here we see listings of the different dates when they registered, what ward, what precinct they were in, what year, their name, their signatures. And then we get information on their residence, their age. This was, I thought, was a really interesting one they added. They added in birthplace. So this could be really helpful when you're trying to trace people that may have come into a bigger city that may have come from elsewhere, whether from another state or even international as well. If there was any occupation or place of business, that also would be noted. In one case, there actually is one woman that is working as a clerk, and it's listed there where she's working on Emerson Street, and even down to like sometimes even the address of where she might be working. Now, you also can find voting lists in town records. So if you want to know how to find the town records, we're going to show you how to do that now, especially for those earlier Freeman's lists and other records you find. So when you're in the card catalog, you want to search at the town level. You want to start at the potentially the town level. So in this case, I'm looking at the town of Hampton in Rockingham County, New Hampshire, and I'm going under the town records category. I want to then go into the one that's actually has like the town clerk or something similar as the author. So I'm going to go into town records 1638 to 1912. So keeping in mind, you can even get town voter records even more contemporary as well. They're not always just restricted to 17th century. So here I can see that the originals are actually held at the state capitol building in Concord, New Hampshire, as well as in Hampton, New Hampshire as well. And it describes what's actually included in these books. So there's different volumes of town records that you're going to find, including tax lists and other things as well. So in this case, you have to really know to dig a little bit more in the records to find what you're looking for, but at least it lets you know what to expect in them. So if I wanted to find a collection I'm interested in, let's say I went up to that top one, 1645 to 1832, I would then go ahead and click the camera icon to browse. And then I would want to scroll through, and usually they're going to be recorded by date. So you may be interested in different dates when you know where you might have had your ancestor living at that time. This was actually out of 1748 that we're finding, and these were actually proprietor meeting minutes that were being held in which they had mentioned who was going to be a moderator and also how they were going to divide out different land as well. Now, we're going to conclude with some different tips for using voter records before we turn to questions. First is that I like to use voter records for a number of different reasons. One particular one which I find is really valuable is if you're trying to identify an immigrant's origins and trying to find out more about them. And this is because, as you saw in some of the examples before, voter registration records include information on where and when they naturalize, because unless you are a native-born citizen or a naturalized citizen, you're not eligible to vote. So using the information in the voter registration book can actually help you track down that elusive naturalization paperwork that you may be looking for. So this is an example in the Lake County, California Great Register, in which there actually are separate columns that are actually listed on naturalization, including the date, the place, and the court. All key pieces of information on how you can find that original naturalization record. And this is just a close-up you can see here. So you can see that there are some individuals that are naturalized in 1869, 1871, 1876, etc., in various courts throughout California in this case. So let's do a quick case study. We're going to look at Christian Nelson. He was born circa 1827 in Norway. He was a laborer and lived in Morgan Valley in Lake County, California. We have his registration date of August 31st, 1877 in the voter records. And he had naturalized in 1876, according to the records, in Napa District Court. So if we using that information from the voter record, we want to then look at the actual records for, in this case, the county of Napa. So we go to our card catalog on family search, we go to Napa, we go to naturalization and citizenship, and we do see there are records available within the time period we're interested in. So once we go there, we want to take a look at the collection. We notice that it's going to include their naturalization records and also indexes, which are also very helpful to note. There is going to be an index you can search. From here, we want to then look at the Index of Naturalized Citizens, 1856 to 1939, since that's the right time frame that we're interested in. And from there, we're going to look through it. So it's going to be alphabetically by the first letter of the surname. It's not going to be in complete alphabetical order. But I eventually came across a Christian Nelson, who is from Norway, and he was naturalized in the district court. And the naturalization was October 9th, 1876. So very close to what we had. We had about that time period. And now we have the book 1 and page 32. So using that information, we can then go into the book to find the naturalization record. So I go back to my catalog here in the Napa County naturalizations. I scroll down until I see the section for Naturalizations District Court Volume 1 with the right time period. And then I go into the camera icon to actually look at the images. I want to make sure I'm always in the right book. So here I'm in Acts of Naturalization, number 1 for Napa County. And then I'm going to browse through those images until I get to the right page. Once I found the page, I found the record, Christian Nelson, who we saw had naturalized October 9th, 1876. It shows that he was an alien and that he was appearing in the satisfaction of court. And it even notes who had actually given affidavits on his behalf. Now, immigrants needed to find citizens, even those that might have naturalized, to be serve affidavits for them on why they are a good character to become citizens of the United States. So potentially you could look at this as your extended fan club approach, your family, associates, and neighbors, and look at these potential other individuals as others that he may have interacted with regularly enough, maybe as neighbors or coworkers or elsewhere, and perhaps maybe one of them has some ties back to Norway, where you could find out more information. So it's giving you another big clue. So even though it just says that he's a native of Norway, you still at least have found the actual paper attached to him now. And at the bottom here, here's the rest of that particular petition. It shows that he had renounced his allegiance, etc., to the King of Sweden and Norway. And you see his signature with his mark. So perhaps he wasn't literate, and the court was signing on his behalf. Now, I also mentioned voter records are a really valuable census substitute. So think of it as a way to find someone in between records, especially when there is a missing census, like the 1890 census, or you're just trying to find someone in between years, because this can help you verify where someone is living at that time, especially if you're not finding them maybe in city directories. You know, they may not have had an occupation or decided to subscribe to the city directory, but they may have wanted to exercise their right to vote at least. So you could use that information to fill in some gaps. And then that can help you then find maybe an ancestor in a census that you were not able to previously find them in, such as if there was a state census record available, or maybe in one of the federal census records. It's also really good for researching formerly enslaved persons because the voter registration record may be the earliest record you might find for someone that was previously enslaved and only really freed with the Emancipation Proclamation, or in the case of Galveston, Texas, on Juneteenth. So something to keep in mind, though, is when you're looking at these voter registers of those that were formerly enslaved, is that often they may be listed in the same voter register as their former enslavers, especially if they stayed in the same area as well. So that might give you some valuable clues if you're finding that maybe they happen to have the same surname or they're in the same area. Those might be individuals you might want to research further to go backwards into different records. And also, it gives you an idea of the residency information might help you identify, has this person been living in the same city or county for the same a long period of time, or are they relatively new to the area? Because that could have an impact on knowing you're looking for some migration that's happened. So as I mentioned, there were records for the 1867 Second Reconstruction Act in which they had to enroll all males over 21 years old, including African Americans, done by the military. So this actually is a wiki page that talks about the 1867 voter registrations. And there are different collections that are available. So you can see they're available for Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. It does not include Tennessee. And so as part of this enrollment, the states also had to swear a new oath of allegiance to the United States and basically rewrite the Constitution to include the 14th and 15th Amendments to make sure they were not trying to impede people's voting rights. So this can be a really valuable collection when you're trying to look into a particular state. So let's say I was going to look into that first one listed for Alabama, and I see that it's a digital collection available from the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Once I click on that, it's actually going to take me right into their digital collections, and this is going to give me a list of qualified voters. There actually is an online database that you can actually search on. So any individual, whether they were previously enslaved or white as well, you also can search on their names here. You can even filter down by race and county and other fields as available to see if you could find your person in that voter registration. So let's say I searched on Collins as a search term. And you'll note that on the preview screen for these images, they will note the race as well, besides the county. So that may help you to filter if you have a very common name that you're searching against. So if I was going to search on Bailey Collins, it's going to pull up the list of return of qualified voters of where they appear in a list with other individuals. So we're going to get a closer look at it. And here we see the list. So here we see that on July 10th, 1867, many of the individuals were registered, some of them on the 11th and the 9th as well. We have the name of the voter. We have information on them here, what their race was and where they were, and if they had signed their oath as well. Noted here with the page information to find out more. And you even can see how long they were in the state. So we can even see that there's ditto marks going down for 12 months on everyone there. So that might give you a good idea that if you're finding, for example, this Collins Bailey in there for 12 months, that since at least 1866, that there could be a good chance that they might have been in the area earlier as well. So in review, I hope this has helped you show that the history behind voting records can really make a difference in how you find records on voting records for your ancestors to see if they were eligible and at what time and what conditions they were under. Voting records can be a valuable census substitute when you can't place someone at a certain period of time. So it's another way to really place someone in a very specific date even, and county, and even sometimes down to a street address as well. If you're looking for immigrant origins, voter records can help you locate an ancestor's naturalization paperwork. And finally, while a lot of voter records are online, not all of them are, so you may need to see copies at your local archives, your Board of Elections offices, and other courthouses and libraries around the country as well. Thank you for listening to my webinar, and now we'll take some questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that great presentation today. So much great information shared there. We've had some wonderful questions coming in. We'll get to those in just a moment, but first I just wanted to highlight a few of our upcoming events very quickly. So first up here, we have an online course in August on Louisiana family history research, going century by century for 4 centuries of history and genealogy. This will be offered on Wednesdays, 6 to 7:30 p.m. And I should mention Melanie is one of the presenters for that course. Then we have another free webinar coming up on August 15th. This is on setting yourself up for success, organizational tools and tips to break down brick walls, presented by our genealogist, Rhonda R. McClure. And then finally here in September, we have another online course kind of coming off the heels of that webinar on expert strategies for breaking down genealogical brick walls. And Melanie will be one of the presenters for this as well, along with David Allen Lambert and Rhonda R. McClure. And that will be September, Wednesday evenings from 6 to 7:30 p.m. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into your questions here. So first up, Melanie, we got a couple of questions about freemen.
Okay.
So what was the time period for freemen, and were freemen records all local, or were they sometimes by county or state?
Okay. So Freeman's records, in the traditional sense of the colonies, they are based on the town where you are inhabitant. So you really are tied to that particular location. For the most part, the status of freedmen was really going on more through the colonies until we really get into the Constitution, in which we revise who was actually eligible to vote. Because once the Constitution was done, there was no longer you had to be a landowner necessarily and be a churchgoer. So it really kind of ended, I would say, with the ratification of the Constitution, that status though. But you might see the term freedman be used in later in later definitions as someone that was not enslaved either. So it depends on how you're, I guess, looking at that term too. But if we're talking about the Freeman's list that we talked about, I would generally say you're looking at, I would say, even really before the before the Constitution was ratified.
Okay, great. And those were all generally local records.
Yes, at the
Okay,
town level.
great.
Yeah, you're going to find those at the town level. You're really not going to find them at the county level like you find other records later on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. We also got a few questions to this effect, as one person phrased it. The registration records seem to include both the dates of voting and the party affiliation, which implies that it was not a secret vote. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on what election was done. So something to keep in mind is that we've been having secret elections going back, I think, to like the even in Massachusetts Bay, I think it was like the 1646 was like their first secret ballots. So some of them are still going to be secret ballots in that um, they might just enumerate how many people from a town voted for a particular candidate. So you also might be seeing that if they're voting for a particular party, it might be like a more local election as well, which might be recorded as well. So it really just depends on what election was being discussed, and how the different agencies were controlling the data, because they're going to have the historical data that might be released later on, but it was at least secret in terms of when you were placing it, others were not directly seeing how you were voting. So it is possible there is a record of your voting record later on that could be pulled.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Another question here for large places like New York City, for example, are records organized by overall city, boroughs, or wards?
Yeah, overall, I'd say depending on when the different boroughs were part of New York City, because obviously that's kind of a complicated history. Generally, you can find that there is different board of elections. There's the city of New York, which can oversee a lot of it, and generally places like the New York City Municipal Archives will oversee all of New York City. So if the records are there, then they will include all the different boroughs. But so it does depend though what time period we're looking at when each of the boroughs was added as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We also got an interesting question from someone wondering if blind citizens were eligible to vote. Historically, do you know if that was the case, or if maybe people with other disabilities? were they generally permitted to vote, or was that not a right that was granted?
I'm not aware of particularly about the specific history. So if I can ask, maybe if the person has a question, do you mind dropping me an email and I could take a look and see if I could find out more? I know that there's definitely been expanded access for people that are blind, but I'm not sure about if I know of any restrictions saying that they were not allowed to vote. I think it was more you might have needed a poll worker to help you cast your vote.
Okay, great. Thank you, Melanie. And yes, if you would like to email Melanie, you can, if you actually want to email us at education@nehgs.org, we can get that over to her. But yeah, that was an interesting
Yeah, it's
question. I
interesting.
hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Um, Another kind of interesting question, and I think we'll have to make this our last one because I'm seeing we're in overtime here. But someone asked, how would voter records be captured for people who were serving in wars during election periods? Do you know that off the top of your head?
So I do know that when absentee voter records were something that was being done, that was something that could be done as a way to cast your vote if you were not in the country. So I believe that a lot of military veterans did use absentee votes as well. But I guess it would depend on, again, what time period we're talking about, though. If there was anything before when that was really a thing. So.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And sorry, I'm actually just going to sneak in another question
Sure.
here because we had a couple of people ask this. On one of the slides, it had a record of women poll taxpayers.
Yes.
And there was an indication for, I believe, one of the women that said over age. And a couple of folks asked, if that means that age was a factor in being able to vote, maybe in particular for women or something like that.
Yeah, I think it just means that they're over the age of 21.
Oh,
So,
interesting. Okay,
yeah, I
great.
mean, I think in some cases they might have just noted that they were just like of the legal age to vote. That's my understanding that they probably were doing that for.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Melanie, again for a great presentation and for fielding the wonderful questions that you've all been submitting. Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for today. But if you do have more specific questions about your family history research, you might consider hiring our research services team or using our chat service as well. The chat service puts you in direct communication with a genealogist. It's totally free and open to the public, and it's available Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5 Eastern Time. To access this free service, you can go to americanancestors.org/chat. I can't recommend that enough. It's a really wonderful option for getting your questions answered. You can also book a one-on-one consultation with our experts at the link shown on the screen or through this QR code displayed there as well. And I'll mention that Melanie is one of our genealogists who gives a lot of our consultations, so you could even book one with her if you'd like. Thank you again for joining us today. And as you leave today's event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more free programs. I hope to see you all at our online programs in the future, and goodbye for now.